Hey, let's talk about asymmetric learning. The goal of asymmetric learning is really very simple. It's to design in competitive advantage to a portfolio or a pipeline or an individual asset. And the goal of asymmetric learning is really to think about your product in a way that's not average. Now, that is really where we talk about asymmetry, which is your desire to outperform. Now, most markets, they kind of behave like this, right? People are happy on a share of voice curve. They're happy on the amount of investment leading to the amount of drugs approved. That performance is symmetrical, right? You're the same as everyone else. Well, if you want to be outperforming somebody, then really asymmetry is what you're hoping for. So what do we mean when we try and apply the idea of asymmetry to learning? Well, you think about this kind of traditional, curve from preclinical phase one through to a launch product. What's the difference? Do the thought experiment. What's the difference between a molecule that sits in preclinical through to one that's launched? The molecule stays exactly the same. No difference. The only difference in the product from preclinical through to the through to launch is that you've learned something. You've learned where it works. You've learned what the side effects are. You've learned what the effect size is. You've learned the population. You've learned maybe how to price it and so forth appropriately. Well, if this is only a learning process, the difference between these two products is in learning. Well, you can make that better. You can learn by having a better approach to learning as you go. So rather than trying to predict everything from the beginning, you might decide to apply the process of learning to your organization. Now keep that thought experiment in mind, because this is really where pharma struggles, right? There's this idea that what we're doing is operational. It isn't. All of it is about learning. Now, we believe that all companies are learning organizations, but the problem that most companies have is that they're learning the way that it used to be done. They're learning the kind of the lessons of the past, if you like, in their approaches, and actually they're applying the rules of average to every drug. So, on average, companies tend to do this. On average, 2 years before launch, we tend to do this. Well, that's no good. That's no good to you if you want to outperform, if you want to be asymmetrical. In some companies, the company learns the ways that it could be done. They start to think differently about the difference between A and B in that development process. Getting a product from here to here actually is a learning exercise. So one of the kind of core mottos of IDEA is, if you give the same asset to two different companies in phase one, which would be more successful? That's the basis for asymmetry that we measure in the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index, is companies that outperform others that are direct competitors in terms of their development and their execution. But let's extend this to another thought experiment. What if you gave the same asset to two different teams in your organization? It stuns me why more companies don't do this, because the only loss, if you like, is in time and energy in the team. But that one team would do better. Now that we all have a kind of gut feel that if you firewall these two teams, one team's going to be better at working on the product than the other is. But let's ask yourself why. It's probably not because one is smarter or more talented or they know more about something than the other. They're going to be better because they learned better. They were better at finding out about opportunity, about planning, about the collection of superior information. And that such a thing exists. There is such a thing as superior information that informs your decisions along the way. But think deeper. Will those teams be enjoying life more than if there's only one team and the only reporting they're doing is up to the up to senior leadership? That element of competition is great. That puts you into a growth mindset. You start to think differently about your interactions with your team members. But the key thing about these teams is that they will be planning to learn. They would spend a lot more time listening. They spend a lot more time really evaluating what's known and unknown about their paths to market. And this extends through what we all know to be true. So if you think about the mechanism of something like valproic acid in epilepsy, 50 years later, we still don't know how it works. We know that it works, but we don't know necessarily how it works. But it's true of so many of the drugs that we work with. We've had this kind of serendipitous process of finding out the drugs do what they do, but not necessarily knowing why or how. And the kind of golden age of pharma wasn't from our kind of targeted, rational design of molecules to do specific things, because that leaves so much unknown on the table. But from the unmet need in the marketplace, really pulling drugs through via this kind of empirical, serendipitous journey towards being functional. But that's the key insight behind asymmetric learning, which is that you learn more by doing than you do by thinking. And our environment is almost the perfect environment to find this out, because the laws of physics that might guide you if you're a rocket scientist don't really apply when you get into the kind of laws of chemistry and biology and pharmacokinetics and so forth, that are just way harder to predict. And the core of this, the kind of in the journey from a kind of molecule through to a product, a launched product, there are just too many assumptions to predict with any validity. You think about the science, you think about the clinical program, you think about the regulatory environment or the commercial landscape. All of those come with assumption risk. So your decision risk in early phase, if you're going to land on one destination early, is just far too great. And it's compounded in the traditional approach, which is to try to do 2 decimal place the NPVs on one option, really, and this kind of idea of premature specialization. We've decided that what this drug is, in this case, an antipsychotic, we decided this very early, and we decided what it's going to focus on very early. The rest of that is now risk that you are wrong. So if you want to get to a confident phase 3 decision, really you need to look at a range of potential destinations and a range of paths. But most of that is really about learning, not just proving the case, because you need to be ready to pivot. You need to be ready to be in a different place than you are when you start to learn and engage. So, at the core of asymmetric learning is this idea of stage appropriate decision making, that if you make all of your decisions at the beginning of phase 1 and going into phase 2 about what the launch product is going to be, well, everything from that point on is risk. So you end up with this kind of very linear kind of learning process where you know something about the one thing that you decided to study, but you don't know anything about the opportunities to outperform your competition. Whereas if you avoid premature specialization, and as you start to move through the process, you're ready to move on and do something else. Your phase 3 is a lot more confidently assigned to, your endpoints have been explored, your value proposition is built in, and you know a lot more about the science because of the way that you've chosen to work on this. But by the time you get to the launch and to the regulators, you also know a lot more about whether the market will want what it is that you're about to give them. Now, this is a very simple model, if you like, to go from this kind of target opportunity profile back into the product, because as soon as you start with a product and you try and go up into the kind of world of the target opportunity profile, trying to predict what a mechanism of action does next to a market opportunity is nearly impossible. But you come the other way around and you start to ask questions from a target opportunity profile, and we've got a very simple model, if you like, of this kind of target opportunity 3-legged stool of, is it approvable? Is it commercially attractive? And can you get from where you are to that point? No 2 legs on that stool would be good enough. No one wants a 2-legged stool. But if you go from the target opportunity profile down into the product, or into the range of products that you've got sitting on your shelves and in your labs, well, you can ask some very significant questions then. What you don't want to be doing is starting with a molecule and then trying to predict all of these other things, the duration, the dose, the pricing, the kind of market segment, the comparators. You just think about the kind of risk involved in any decision that includes all of that. But that's exactly the way that things work at the moment. So if you start with an opportunity landscape and you come back into the molecule, we're in a very different place. But the idea of planning to learn is very different than the idea of just executing against a prediction that you made early on. And really our goal is to move companies away from what we see as the kind of, it's the kind of prediction paradigm that we've always grown up with, if you like, of trying to predict everything. The emphasis is on being right, trying to get the forecast right, trying to know what the mechanism does, trying to know what, this is why we all end up confident when we're sitting on a symmetrical line when we've done as well as the competition. It's why outperforming is not really built into the way that we want things to be. So the idea of asymmetric learning is really to move towards learning by doing, learning by having an approach to a growth mindset for the asset, for the team, for everyone to collect superior information with which to make decisions, recognizing that the decisions that you need to take in preclinical and phase one are not the same decisions as you have when you go to phase three, not just in magnitude, but in the character of those decisions as well. So asymmetric learning is about outperforming. It's about enhancing really your early phase planning. And the idea of the early phase planning is that you're planning to learn, not just to prove, so that your approach from that point onwards is not just a collection of operational reports. It's actually a where are we now and what do we know now that we didn't know before, and what decision will we take today if we were about to embark upon it. So let's do better. Thanks.